Okay, great. So it's a pleasure to be here today. Um, I was realizing earlier this morning, this first time in 8 months that I've given a public talk. So bear with me. You know, it's one thing to give a public talk, which I'm very comfortable in, but it's another thing to do so sitting down at my desk. Remembering which buttons to press. So let me begin by three important acknowledgements. The first is, of course, the Coast Salish lands on which all of us are, most of us here on this call are now residing. The second, and this is hugely important to me, is my first cohort of Secwepemc students back in 1991, when they took me under their wing, in a sense, and I learned more from them than I think they learned from me in terms of archaeology. And then a third very important acknowledgement is my wife, Catherine Carlson, who's the one who got me to British Columbia in the first place. And it's been quite a journey since I got here, as some of my presentation will reveal. So let me put this all into context as to where I'm going. This wasn't something I'd really planned to do, but last week Ross sent around a note saying that the original presenter for today had to cancel. And at the same time, there was a letter from the Student Society to the faculty requesting their desire to have more discussion in class on racism and related topics. And I think there was simply a moment of weakness as well in terms of, you know, being here on campus virtually every day and having no one to talk to. So, you know, all of that led to today, but also a very fortuitous date of American Thanksgiving. And how could I resist speaking about decolonization on American Thanksgiving, a national holiday celebrating a successful colonial venture. So the topic of decolonization is one that has great relevance today, as it has for some time. But currently we are in a very highly charged, politically and otherwise, time where a number of social movements have sort of come together, a perfect storm for conservatives and other parties who have a hard time dealing with or acknowledging minority and oppressed and invisible groups. I also saw this as an opportunity to revisit from a personal perspective some of what I've been doing relative to decolonization, and importantly also to illustrate that decolonization can take a number of different forms. And I want to illustrate a small number of those, again, from my own perspective and my own work. A year or so ago, Hugo Cardosa had given a seminar on what he was going to do during his then upcoming sabbatical. And I saw that as a structure that I could use here today in terms of what I've done, what I am doing now that I am on a year sabbatical, and what I will be continuing to do afterwards. I'm also giving this I'm also giving this talk as a way to share some of my own experiences and motivations and work on this topic as it relates to decolonization, in the same way that in teaching my archaeological theory course, I often use myself as a guinea pig to talk about my own experiences relative to the development of or application of particular theoretical trajectories. And then finally, we could look at this in the sense of a sort of neo-evolutionary perspective, and to acknowledge that change ultimately comes and emanates from the level of individual organisms. And the change accumulates and eventually transcends into social change or larger responses or not, if you want to look at evolutionary dead ends. But with decolonization, we are not talking about an evolutionary dead end. It's very important too that I emphasize this point, that while I'm focusing on my own work, there are many in this department who are doing comparable work in terms of decolonization in the classroom, in the field, and in other contexts. And I've learned much from each of these individuals, and I'm also hugely proud of our graduate students in particular for their efforts, and most proud of Chelsea and Laura and Catherine's hot off the press book, Working with and for Ancestors, Collaboration in the Care of Ancestral Remains. This is a huge accomplishment, and it really points a direction that this up and coming generation of archaeologists is moving forward with, this understanding of the kinds of changes that we do need to be making. Now, in addition to this being an unattended seminar, some of the story that I'm going to recount is very much an unintended journey. As a graduate student, I grew up in the new archaeology. My view of the world is grounded in science and an empirical understanding of the world around me. And much of my work, particularly up to the early 1990s, was focusing on very Binfordian approaches to archaeology, including early post-glacial land use and prehistoric human ecology of wetlands. And these are research areas that I still continue with. But there's also a maturation that occurs as we get older, as we are more and longer invested in archaeology. And I often point to D.L. Clark's Archaeology, The Loss of Innocence as a seminal article in showing the maturation theoretically of archaeology. And in their discussion of Clark's very challenging article, Mike O'Brien and colleagues write this, that we didn't get into archaeology to invent new paradigms or to write histories of the discipline or to do scientific stuff. We got into it because at the time it looked like fun, and it is. And they go on to speak to their own experiences here. But they also point to the fact, as did Clark, that the more we understand archaeology or think we do, the less we ultimately do understand it. And that's because we start to see its limitations, which is a good thing because it then forces us to move or to try to move beyond those. And I had my own loss of innocence that emanated really from work that I began in Kamloops in 1991, beginning to work with and work for the Secwepemc and other indigenous groups, initially in British Columbia and then elsewhere. And as a result of that first encounter with the SFU campus that we had on the Kamloops Indian Reserve and my developing what would become one of the first indigenous archaeology programs elsewhere, I really lost my innocence in terms of archaeology. And to paraphrase O'Brien et al., I didn't get into archaeology to conduct research on or to promote indigenous archaeology or heritage as a human right, or protecting intangible heritage, or recognizing the denigration of heritage sites as violence, and so on. I still do straight ahead archaeology, but these topics have become the core of my essence, in a manner of speaking. And some of that interest, some of those efforts culminated in the collaborative international project that I developed with my colleagues Kelly Bannister and Julie Hollowell, the Intellectual Property Issues and Cultural Heritage, or IPINCH project, that brought together Indigenous and non-Indigenous practitioners and academics and community specialists, heritage specialists, to really explore in a critical way how and why cultural heritage was being appropriated, what were the costs to Indigenous and other peoples, and how could we move ahead in a good way to try to resolve some of the outstanding issues that we've been dealing with earlier and still today. The IPINCH project focused on 8 themes: bioarchaeology and DNA, cultural appropriation, community-based research, research ethics, Indigenous heritage law, and cultural tourism, as well as funding about 15 community-based research projects around the world. So that is a nutshell for putting this presentation into context. But I now want to turn to decolonization, this very sometimes slippery term, and to give you 3 working definitions, as it were, of it. These are taken from pulling together a guide for curriculum developers. And you'll find other definitions, certainly some more academic, some more general, but I think these 3 suffice for today. Decolonization, the process of deconstructing colonial ideologies, the superiority and privilege of Western thought and approaches. Indigenization, a process of naturalizing Indigenous knowledge systems and making them evident to transforming spaces, places, and hearts. And reconciliation, addressing past wrongs done to Indigenous peoples, making amends and improving relationships, and so on. Although there is a degree of overlap between the 3 of these, decolonization is ultimately a very, very different objective from the other 2. And that is because it requires a major rethinking of how things are structured. And if you've heard me talk about reconciliation in other contexts, what I've often stated is that reconciliation has to mean more than just saying sorry. It means changing fundamentally how things are. And that's one of the key goals of decolonization, and that is to change those structures. And that is hugely, hugely difficult to accomplish because it requires, and this is the key point here, it requires those holding power to relinquish it, or at least a portion of it. Decolonization also brings forward a number of research methods and strategies that both work to change that power structure, but also to foreground Indigenous values, perspectives, and objectives, amongst other things. There are a host of methods, some found in other realms of archaeology, but these are very necessary ones, and they take different forms as different communities and different groups utilize them to address their own particular needs, whether through community-led projects, whether through social justice initiatives, and so on. Now, on the positive side, there have been major developments in archaeology and the realm of heritage that, in a sense, speak to moving forward in a good way over the past 20, 30 plus years. We are seeing that archaeology is increasingly culturally diverse, with Indigenous peoples, people of color, minority groups, and many, many others now becoming part of the archaeological endeavor. Repatriation is now a very familiar process, and it's now in many contexts more voluntary than it is legislated. We have, of course, the emergence of indigenous archaeology. There's the dissolution of that once familiar trope of archaeologists versus indigenous peoples. We see major capacity building in many indigenous communities around the world. We are seeing more and more indigenous developed projects in archaeology and heritage management. There are some indigenous groups that have their own archaeologists as well as heritage offices. And we are seeing that some of the once contentious aspects of archaeological research, including ancient DNA and osteoarchaeology and so on, now being actively sought by indigenous peoples to learn the life histories of their ancestors. And there are many, many other very positive developments that we could all celebrate in. But, and of course there's a but here, we're a long way still from being post-colonial. And one major bottleneck here is that heritage legislation is still controlled by the dominant majority population, a population that in settler countries has come from somewhere else. We are seeing stewardship as still the primary model used in archaeological heritage management. And it has many commendable aspects to it, but it is also very problematic because it lacks in neutrality. It foregrounds a Western perspective. There is a limited accommodation of indigenous perspectives. And again, that reluctance to give up any degree of control or decision-making for the most part. Heritage resource management, which is today the most common form of archaeology worldwide, is still strongly influenced, in some cases controlled, some will argue, by economic and political interests. And it's virtually every week we will come across another news report of other sites, other heritage places being destroyed, being disturbed, or not being given the protection and recognition that they should be afforded. We see that heritage, indigenous heritage is largely viewed as public domain, free for the taking, and that the public is still very undereducated and has a hard time understanding what indigenous heritage means. One point to emphasize here is that reconciliation and decolonization are different. And in many settler countries, federal and state governments are still pushing for reconciliation, sometimes only nominally, without really understanding that indigenous peoples have moved far beyond and are calling for decolonization. Again, it's not just saying we're sorry, it's changing how things are done. And that is one major goal of decolonization. So those comments give you a sense of working definitions of and some of the goals of decolonization writ large. But I now want to shift over to what decolonization looks like in practice, and again, primarily from my own experiences. And I want to do this by looking at decolonizing where and who in 6 different realms. And of course, there is overlap between these. So in the classroom, one of the major courses that I teach and have taught probably 30 times here at SFU is the undergraduate course, Archaeological Theory. And in this course, I cover the history of archaeological thought, going back thousands of years up to the present. And I also talk about many different contemporary aspects of archaeological theory and practice and the ethics thereof. But relative to the topics of decolonization and indigenous peoples, I have specific lectures on these topics, on the emergence of colonial interests in archaeology, Marxist and critical archaeologies, indigenous archaeologies, archaeology and other descendant communities, race and identity, and theory, ethics, power, and prestige, and, and archaeological activism. Excuse me, I'm talking more today than I have in probably the last few months, so bear with me. And in the archaeological theory course, I introduce the notion of how the world was colonized in the 16th, 17th, and 18th, 19th centuries. And with these map projections, you see a glimpse of the scope of colonization. All of the Americas, all of Oceania, all of Africa, most of Africa, and major portions of the rest of the world. And the point of introducing this to undergrads is to help them understand why some of the contemporary issues that we're dealing with formerly colonized countries like Zimbabwe, or the plight faced by indigenous and other minority peoples in an archaeological realm have come to be. So what are the consequences of colonization relative to heritage management today? Why are the Parthenon marbles in the British Museum? And many, many other questions like that. I also introduced this notion of scientific colonialism. And this is something that we still bear the cost of today. We are still dealing with a legacy of scientific colonialism today in contemporary archaeology, as outlined in these 8 or 9 points. And one thing that we need to understand, and our students need to understand, is that we, the archaeologists, are the ones who tend to benefit the most from other people's heritage. That's long been the way it is historically, and it still is the way today for many archaeological realms. That through the work we do here in North America as Euro-Canadian or Euro-American archaeologists researching indigenous Canadian or indigenous Native American research, we're the ones who may be given tenure and promotion for the results of our research on other people's heritage. We become the acknowledged experts. We become the gatekeepers of the past. And that last point of becoming gatekeepers is not something that we ourselves are really responsible for taking on that role. It's the role that is essentially vested in us as the experts in the past. So we have all of these other entities that convey that responsibility upon us. So these are, some of the things that I think help our students to understand essentially the roots of the need for decolonization in terms of unequal power relations, a core concept here. I point out that the familiar terms of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat have a contemporary role when we switch out archaeologists for the bourgeoisie, we being the ones who monopolize the means of production and subsistence relative to research on heritage and the benefits that come from that, and switch out the proletariat for indigenous peoples, the ones who still have lack of access to or decision-making control over their own heritage. It's at this point too that I'm able to introduce indigenous archaeology, how and why it's developed, the many different forms that it takes, the goals that it has. And this is something that has been near and dear to my heart for 30 years now. And I think that the classroom is a way where I and all of us can share our experiences in a kind of trickle-up effect for those of us who work in the realm of decolonization or reconciliation or indigenous issues. We pass that on, we must pass that on to our students. And again, pointing out other issues, in this case, dealing with the ancient one, Kennewick man, and why he was, and in fact still is, a keystone in coming to grips, coming to understanding with the nature of indigenous heritage relative to non-indigenous conceptions of a scientific approach to past people's lives. Now, a second course I want to briefly mention is a graduate course, and this is ARC 5551, Ethics and Practice. This is a course I developed with Joanne Hammond, and this is one of our 4 courses in a professional master's in heritage management program. And this course is designed for heritage management practitioners, those who are currently in the field, who want to go on and gain additional credentials and understanding and confidence, along with a thesis, in order to move forward in their careers. And in this particular course, Joe Hammond and I focus on ethics and practice and deal with, some of the real ethical complexities that are found throughout contemporary cultural heritage management. And we deal with some real stinkers here. Whether it has to do with continued disturbance of ancestral burial grounds, including those that are known, or complaints from the public that they should not be on the hook for paying for the cost of archaeological research on indigenous sites that may be affected by their development of their own property, that is, of non-indigenous peoples developing their property in which there are indigenous sites. There are also those like Widdowson and Howard's book that is calling out indigenous peoples and their allies for political correctness, for raising concerns about such issues as indigenous heritage. And there are many, many other examples that come up frequently here in British Columbia and elsewhere, whether it's pipeline development here in British Columbia, whether it's Rio Tinto. I mean, we have no shortage of examples. And so this is something that Joe Hammond and I, address in this particular course. A second area where we look to decolonize is in government policies. And one example is here in British Columbia in 2014, the provincial archaeology branch had given permission to a landowner to develop a house on Grace Islet, a 1 hectare piece of land you see in front of you that had 16 recorded burial cairns on it. This was clearly in contravention of the BC Heritage Act. There was a huge outcry. There was a 1.5 years of protests by local First Nations and efforts by their allies, including by the iPinch project that I directed. We developed what became known as the Declaration on the Safeguarding Indigenous Ancestral Burial Grounds as Sacred Sites and Cultural Landscapes. And here we lay out the rationale, the reasons for why such places must be protected. And we reminded the federal government and the provincial government of their existing legal and ethical obligations under law. And I'm glad to say that in early 2015, the Grace Islet controversy was settled. Another example is a report that Dave Sheppy, Kirsten Delata, and I were commissioned to prepare for the First Peoples Heritage Language and Culture Council. And that is to critically review and provide recommendations for decolonizing BC's heritage-related processes and legislation. And on the right side of the screen, you see the cover of this report. We hope to release this very shortly. But on the cover, you will see a very explicit example of decolonization. And this is a sign created by Joe Hammond, I mentioned a moment ago. That is a rewriting of some of the historic signage found throughout British Columbia. And what Joe has done here is to show what decolonization can look like in a very simple act. Now, in this report, Dave, Kirsten, and I critically examined 17 policies listed here. These may be familiar to some of you here in British Columbia. And for each of these, we provided something along these lines. An initial summary of the document outlining its intent, our analysis of the policy, and what we found or find problematic about it. And then a list of pertinent UNDRIP articles, and those from the Pertinent Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. So this is something that we've done for each of these. I should also add that the report is prefaced by 15 to 20 pages of discussion on the nature of Indigenous cultural heritage, on decolonization and related terms and issues. And the report concludes with a series of recommendations. Again, we hope to be able to share this report with everyone soon. In terms of other initiatives, in 2018, the Ainu, the Indigenous peoples of Northern Japan, were officially recognized by the Japanese government as the Indigenous peoples of Japan. Since 2009, my colleague Joe Watkins and I, along with our colleague Hirofumi Kato, have been working closely with the Ainu in Nibutani and elsewhere in Japan to help address their concerns about continuing loss of ancestral sites, continuing concerns about the repatriation of their ancestors, and cultural repatriation, amongst other longstanding and ongoing issues. A third realm, decolonizing research ethics. In 2014, the iPinch project organized 2 workshops here at Simon Fraser University in collaboration with the university's Research Ethics Office. During the course of the iPinch project, and specifically in funding or getting funds to our various community partners for community-based initiatives, we were put through the ringer here at SFU through the Ethics Office and through the Office of Research Services in order to get funding transferred, in order to complete all the necessary ethics applications. And we worked hard to basically then share the lessons learned with the Office of Research Ethics so that they could better improve the process here, and also to share our hard-earned lessons with others. So that's what we did with these 2 meetings. Then SFU President Andrew Petter, long supporter of the iPinch project, joined us for one of these. In 2015, we opened up a conference to a wide swath of people involved in research ethics, from people here at SFU and other university research ethics offices, federal funding agencies, and researchers who are working with and for Indigenous groups. And this was our Working Better Together conference. And if you're interested, you'll find all the videos and the proceedings volume on our website. Since then, I've been working with Vicki Kelly and Kelly Bannister in particular to continue our collaboration with SFU's Office of Research Ethics. And what we've been doing over the past year plus is to ensure that Indigenous voices and values are firmly embedded in the research application system in a far more respectful and far more evident way than they have been in the past. And that is now reflected in the new research ethics application system here at SFU that just launched last week. So we're very glad to see this moving forward. But as with all ethics application processes, it has to be looked at it as an organic process. And we will be continuing to refine this over time. Another area that touches on research ethics, and this is another legacy project of the iPinch project, is dealing with bioarchaeology and genetic data. And the realm of DNA and ancient DNA research is fraught with peril, or at least requires careful consideration of the benefits, but also the harms that can be done, as outlined in this figure from a special issue of the International Journal of Cultural Property that Julie Hollowell and I edited on bioarchaeology and genetic research in 2009. In 2015, the iPinch project hosted the DNA and Indigeneity Symposium, bringing together some of the leading research in this realm, as well as leading community spiritual leaders. The bottom right on the left-hand side is Armin Minthorn. He's the spiritual leader of the Umatilla and was very much involved in the repatriation of the Ancient One. This was also a public event that we held, and again, we have videos of proceeding volume available online. And then more recently, as to a degree, an extension of this is the Ancient DNA and Ethics Project. And here we are focusing specifically on research on Indigenous North American ancient DNA, following the kinds of concerns that have been raised, and to better develop more responsible and more informed research practices. And what is central here is full representation from our Indigenous partners. On the right, on the left, you'll see the research team. On the right, major collaborators and working group leads. So we have very strong representation from Indigenous North American and Hawaiian peoples. Our research methods, our project goals. And ultimately what we're after here is to improve the process, to make it work better for everyone. We are conducting 2 surveys. The first is just completed, and this was directed to those working in ancient DNA labs and other initiatives. The second just started, and here we are requesting input from Indigenous partners and participants in ancient DNA research. And if you know of anyone who has been involved or is interested, please direct them to me or to the website. We are working on a series of publications. One is forthcoming next year in the Journal of Social Archaeology. This being The Ethical Crisis in Ancient DNA Research, the Chaco Canyon Controversy as a Case Study. This involves a controversial study on ancestral remains from Pueblo Bonito excavated over 100 years ago. A very interesting set of research results coming out in terms of mitochondrial DNA representing a matrilineage of elite. And at the same time, the American Museum of Natural History, which was a repository, really failed to fully fulfill its obligations in at least an ethical sense. It followed to the letter the provisions of NAGPRA. But as David Hurst Thomas, then responsible for decision-making at the American Museum of Natural History relating to giving permission to the researchers to access the ancestral remains, Dave Thomas points out the decision to rely solely on NAGPRA was a mistake, because NAGPRA really provides no guidelines for the ethics of research. And perhaps even more problematic is that the researchers nor the American Museum of Natural History did not consult with the Puebloan tribes about the research planned. So this is something, this controversy is something that we tease apart in this article, using both newspaper reports, a series of interviews conducted, and a meta-analysis of the overall situation. Decolonizing the marketplace. So one of the major issues that Indigenous people have is that their heritage has been used as really a playground, really as a source of inspiration, really as a source of information for product developers, merchants, musicians, artists, and others. And this is cultural appropriation because it's taking without asking. It's using aspects of Indigenous heritage in ways that are unwelcome, that are harmful, that are inappropriate, without recompense, without permission. And this is something that we were dealing with almost daily with the iPinch project, and I'm still hit up with virtually every week with queries about new appropriations. To help inform the public, to help inform product developers, we developed a Think Before You Appropriate booklet, which really provides some basic guidelines and common sense as to how to avoid cultural appropriation, what are the costs to developers as well as to Indigenous peoples of appropriation, what are the benefits of working together, of asking permission, of collaborating. This booklet is on our website. It's been downloaded a gazillion times. It's received international attention. And it's something we're very proud of because it really helps to address the problem that most people want to do the right thing, but they don't know what the right thing to do is. And this guidebook is one aid to them. This is an ongoing concern for the Ainu, as well as many, many other Indigenous peoples. The Ainu want to share their culture. They want to have others join them in celebrating their culture through, in new ways, through product designs, through Ainu designs on Ainu developed clothing, and so on, through manga. But there is rampant cultural appropriation. And so the last time I was in Japan last fall, meeting with the Biratori Ainu Association and the Nibitani Craft Association, I pledged my support to help them deal with this ongoing need. And we had the Think Before You Appropriate guide translated into Japanese. Very simple step, but one that can really help them in very big ways. I'm often asked to comment on such things as cultural appropriation and Halloween relative to traditional Indigenous clothing and some of the odd, if not disrespectful forms it may take. In response to a piece I wrote in Sapiens, I was honored to make it onto Fox News, and somewhat disconcerted by some of the emails that I received from Fox News readers who completely misunderstood what I was writing about relative to cultural appropriation and Halloween, which was cultural appropriation is better targeted in other days, that Halloween is really a day of cultural anarchy where anything goes. So there is a pushback to trying to educate people about such things as cultural appropriation. Decolonizing through public outreach. This is something that I think all of us need to do or can do a better job at in terms of informing the public about Indigenous heritage values or Indigenous worldviews or Indigenous knowledge. That it may be very similar to, it may be somewhat different from Western worldviews, for example, but it is not any less legitimate. It is not any less important. It is not any less empirical as are the more familiar Western modes. And I've tried to educate the public about this, again, through a variety of writing for the public in terms of how traditional knowledge can extend Western science, not replace it, but can help it by providing new ways of understanding from the thousands of years of observations made by indigenous peoples. Now, again, sometimes there's pushback. And when this piece was published on Smithsonian.com, there were literally hundreds of very, very positive comments and a few that, again, totally misread the article. And this is something that in our outreach, we need to be very cognizant of and be prepared for pushback like this. But I've done this in terms of looking at the loss of heritage sites by development as a violation of human rights in a variety of contexts. And I get far greater readership for any of these public blogs than I do for any of my academic writing. And that's a good thing because I want the public to really be the ones who benefit from what I've learned. And then one other example of outreach is in 2015, the iPinch Project helped to organize the President's Dream Colloquium on Indigenous heritage and governments. And here we brought some of the leading thinkers of Indigenous cultural heritage preservation and taking next steps forward, including Rosita Worrell and Grand Chief Ed John and Linda DeHawa Smith. And you'll find their videos too on the iPinch website. And then one last realm, and that's the academy. That's all of us. And over the years, I've been pushing forward these arguments. These are 4 points that I believe very deeply in, and they really resonate with my academic writing, my teaching, and my public outreach. And there are many ways that we can forward these messages. And I've talked about, writing for the public, but I also, write for the academy. And here are just a few examples of some of the recent work that I've been doing that touches on, some very different realms, whether it has to do with, the denigration, destruction of heritage as violence, or looking at 3D scanning and printing and how we can deal with that more ethically, or looking at intellectual property and archaeology from a legal perspective, or in terms of heritage rights and policy changes in Canada. I'm also involved in some larger scale projects, including one that I'm very excited about with Andrew Martindale, Marge Bruchak, and Keisha Supernat on Indigenous oral traditions in archaeology. A second is a follow-up to my being and becoming Indigenous archaeologist. So looking at, a new crop of Indigenous peoples and native-born archaeologists. And then another collaborative project, in this case with Claire Smith, Kelly Pollard, and Chris Wilson, who's on the call, focusing on Indigenous perspectives in archaeology through museums and science and in other realms. There is one project along those lines that I abandoned with my two co-authors, Joe Watkins and Uzma Rizvi. I was asked to prepare a volume for Polity Press's Decolonizing series aimed at undergraduates. And they wanted to do one on sociology and one on political economy, one on archaeology and so on. We developed the full perspective, but then we came to, as they say, creative differences as to how we wanted to proceed and how the editors wanted to. So we stepped down from the project. We may, go forward with this in a different way at some point. So where do we go from here? I want to stress that decolonization is not just a goal, but it's an ongoing process. It's not just renewal and revitalization, it's a political act. Also to mention that many of us deal with decolonization and indigenization and reconciliation, even when we don't use those terms. I've given you a very personal account, talked about collaborations that I've been fortunate to be involved with. What I really haven't been talking much about is how challenging this is. But one way to counter those challenges is that I've been able to leverage my very privileged position as a senior white male archaeologist to really push forward and to really agitate in some circles for change. I've of course made mistakes, as I've been told by community members, if you're not making mistakes, you're not working hard enough. And this is something I think we all need to be prepared to, get pushed back, to be yelled at by the people that we want to work with. But this is really how we make good and lasting relationships. But enough about me, what about you, as the expression goes. I want to turn this around and have you ask yourself these three questions. What are your responsibilities here as a citizen, as a student or educator, as a member of the CAA or SAA, as a parent, as a voter? Do you know your responsibilities as a visitor to someone else's land? Excuse the misspellings. Do you know the treaties and other provincial and federal obligations of where you live? So those are things to consider. And I'm just going to leave you, with these 5 points in terms of taking a pragmatic, taking a realistic, taking a well-informed, self-aware approach to decolonizing archaeology. Requires honesty, requires recognizing different histories. It requires that heritage means different things to different people in different contexts. We need to be willing to translate in both directions, our goals and community goals. And we need to really respect cultural differences. So I'll just leave you with these 4 points. Learn to listen, be informed, be willing to act, and be persistent as we move forward in our goals towards a better approach to Indigenous heritage. Thank you.